Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Morris and I live in the Blue Ridge Mountain country near the Hungry Mouth State Park in a beautiful historic manor house that was actually built in 1943 and was renovated as recently as 2001. The house was fully gutted and restored, keeping some of the beautiful traditional features like the flagstone floors, original wooden floors and beams, as well as the brick walls, which are a stunning feature in our home. Our house is adorned with emerald green shutters and a complimentary green roof. Our spacious abode with its ample-sized windows overlooks the most exquisite panoramic views over luxurious carpets of rolling green countryside, areas of large natural emerald forest consisting of sugar maple trees, birch, American beech, eastern white pine and hazelnut trees. And then, of course, we have the exquisite Blue Ridge Mountains towering up into the sky like blue-grey misty pyramids in splendid repose. I have lived here on my father's farm all my life, which fortunately I inherited after his death in 1989. I live here with my wife Amanda and our two kids, Alison, who's 10, and William, who's 12. I've always been an outdoorsy person and love everything to do with nature. So working with the animals and growing crops on my land with the sun beating down gently on my face is the heartbeat of my life. I have a few horses for recreational purposes only, and I raise some pigs and chickens and grow plenty of corn and vegetables, as well as indulge in a little hunting from time to time in the wooded area of my land, where we have great hunting opportunities and amazing hefty species of deer. My story begins when one day I heard gunshots coming from my woods, followed by these loud audible screams of someone who was clearly in distress. Using my binoculars, I surfed the area around my woods, and that was when I saw a man running through my cornfields as fast as he possibly could, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, and the sound he was making was so terrifying it literally caused the hair on the back of my neck to stand on end. I was wondering what on earth was happening to the seemingly frightened, petrified man, whom I suspected very quickly was a poacher, as he was clutching a rifle and looking frenetically back over his shoulder towards the forest every few seconds. Even though I was watching this drama unfold from a distance, I could literally feel this man's terror. It was that palpable, even though I was watching through my binoculars. Then suddenly I saw this threatening creature emerge out of the dusky shadows, and there he was, a creature the likes of such that I've never had the privilege of seeing before in my entire life. Truly this thing was like a Herculean, bipedal ape-like giant. I know of no other way to describe this jumbo-sized beast. He was covered completely in long waves of shaggy brown-grey hair that flowed in the wind as he moved his powerful, imposing, majestic form with a masterful fluidness and agility that was unlike anything I have ever witnessed before. At a strapping 9 foot tall, 800 pounds and 5 feet wide, he was racing towards the terrified man on his long, agile legs, running with the majesty and speed of a cheetah, with 5 foot strides. It was like watching a scene from Natural Geographic unfold on television before me with seamless fluidity, which had a bewitching hold over me as I watched in stunned amazement, hardly daring to believe what I was actually seeing. The seemingly small form of a svelte man in a white shirt was staggering and shaking violently from terror, and was so uncoordinated and dithery. If you did not know better, you would think he was drunk. He looked behind him frantically as the hairy humanoid got ever closer with every step. Although everything seemed to happen incredibly quickly, it felt as if I was watching everything in slow motion. I continued to watch in horror as the man barely made it to his bright red jeep in time. It appeared that fear had seemingly incapacitated his every move, so he struggled to run forwards, pushing his legs as if he was treading water. He finally made it back to his car, and his fingers were wobbling violently as clumsily he managed to open his car door, throwing himself onto the seat, slamming the door behind him and revving up the engine, but failing to get it started on his first futile attempts, which stalled and prolonged his desperate anguish to escape. This incredible hulk of a Titanic-sized creature lunged towards the back of the car like a lion mounting its prey from the rear. It proceeded to lift the back of the jeep so that the front of the car was perching precariously on its 2 wheels. I kid you not, this giant creature looked as if he was picking up a toy car in his hands. He made the jeep look like it weighed next to nothing in his huge sausage-sized fingers, almost like he was opening a can of tuna. I was boggled by such an extraordinary display of super robustness, brawn, and strength. The creature let out a thunderous roar that sent the fear of God diving through every fibre of my being. Believe me, I've never heard a roar like that before, and it truly made a lion's roar seem like a pussycat by comparison, and I am not kidding. He then begrudgingly released his hold on the back of the car, and it slammed to the ground, bouncing on the back wheels. I could see the rubescent, blushing, petrified face of the driver as he started the engine and hightailed it down the dirt road in his car as fast as he possibly could. I doubted that he would ever be seen poaching on my land again. I watched the dark, shadowy form of the huge giant creature retreating back into the forest, and he was shaking his fists angrily in an expression of incandescent rage. I knew that if that creature had wanted to kill that man, he would have done so effortlessly, and he would have done it now. It would have been nothing for him to prize him out of his car like an olive in a jar of brine. So in my opinion, he did not want this man anywhere near his turf, or hunting anywhere, any of the wildlife on my land. I truly think the creature had physically restrained himself from extracting the petrified man from his vehicle and squeezing his head like a chicken egg so that his brains burst over the seats. Sorry for being so gruesome and graphic, but I truly sensed and believe that this is what he wanted to do, but perhaps a touch of humanity and compassion held him back. I was to realize after some research that this hairy humanoid ape-like creature was called a Bigfoot, a hairy man, or a yeti. I had heard of such a creature before in fleeting conversations from farmers, some who swore to have had brief sightings of the hairy critter. On my part, I thought these encounters were highly exaggerated and almost fanciful. Now I realize many of these so-called encounters farmers claim to have had were possibly underplayed for fear of being ridiculed or mocked by the cynics among us. I believe that the Bigfoot I'd witnessed was the one wearing the title Phantom of the Forest that the Shawnee Indians believe was put on the earth to protect the woods and all the animals living in its midst. These Indian warriors knew that if they hunted and violated the natural laws of nature by allowing a creature they had killed to go to waste, they would inevitably face the wrath of the Phantom of the Forest. He would quite literally pay them back in kind by hacking them to death without a second thought, leaving their remains to be devoured and eaten by the wild predators, so that they could sacrificially give back to the earth what they had so greedily wasted. So the Shawnee Indians were very careful to hunt wisely and to never take more than they needed, using every part of the animal for food and for clothes. Some believe that the formidable phantom of the forest could read the intention and mindset of every hunter in the woods, like a book, and it was believed that he loved and protected the deer that were like to him his very own children. Legend had it that this hefty creature was sometimes seen riding a deer in the woods, but that must have been a hilarious sight to see, as an elephantine-sized creature riding a significantly small animal would certainly have been physically impossible, but legends do contain elements of truth, let me assure you. I had frequented the woods on my land occasionally, but anything I ever killed was eaten by my family, and I even used the hides, so nothing ever went to waste, I'm glad to say. I do know that on every hunt in my woods, I had always felt that I was being watched and observed very closely, and now I'm almost certain it was this Bigfoot, ensuring that I did not violate the natural laws on my land, and I am glad to say, in hindsight, as I did not, as every life form is precious and has cosmic value and worth. Fast forward a couple of weeks, and once again I heard gunshots on my land, and I immediately suspected that there must be another poacher out there in my woods, trying to kill a hefty whitetail. I correctly assumed that things would not bode well for this man, and given that the phantom of the forest was definitely out there. I pinned my binoculars on my forest to see if I could see anything, and then I saw a man in a blue t-shirt, clutching his rifle tightly to his body, and creeping out of the forest very carefully, turning his head frantically in every direction, almost as if he knew he was being stalked. I watched him crawling slowly through the cornfields, slithering through the fields like a snake, but as he crept ever forwards, the ears of the corn would sway, revealing his hiding place, giving it away all too easily. Suddenly, thundering through the forest like a herd of rhinos, was the Bigfoot, and his mean expression was of utter revulsion and fury. He hurtled towards the cornfields, seizing the man by his legs, gripping them ever so tightly in his long arms, and turning him upside down, where he dangled precariously with his head only inches above the ground. I heard the man's audible cries for help. "Help! Help! Help! Help!" came the screams. I watched in trepidation as the Bigfoot was swinging him backwards and forwards like a crystal pendulum. Truly, this 90-kilogram man looked like a doll in this creature's hand, as he was swung backwards and forwards several times, as if the creature was toying with him. I could hear the shrill screams emitted by the young man echo through the valley and bounce back, and the sounds even had my lazy Cheshire cat, Purdy Poo, bolt up from her long sleep and pounce onto my window pane, with a fervent curiosity written on her face, as if she was even saying to me, "What the heck was that?" I just froze to the spot, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing, and things happened so quickly, but in seconds seemed like hours, as invariably it does in heightened moments of intense drama. Suddenly the creature drew the man's head upwards towards his face, locking eyes with his, and letting out a thunderous roar that even caused some crystal glasses on my sideboard to wobble under the vibration, even from a fair distance away. The phantom of the forest tossed the man violently on the ground, with a look of repugnant disgust on his face, as if he regarded the man as a lower form of pond life, where he deposited him on some ears of corn and left him there. I watched the Bigfoot retreating back into the woods, and once he was gone, I ran over to the man, who was very badly injured. It was a young man of about 24, and he was crying out in pain, clutching the stomach area of his body and dragging his legs. I helped him to his car and observed that he could barely stand or even walk, because he was so crumpled, and he was bruised and battered. His 2 friends were waiting for him in the car. I advised them to take him to the hospital because it looked like he had broken a few bones and he could have some internal bleeding. I also told them not to come poaching on my land again, or they would be in serious trouble, not just from me, but the hairy creature in the woods. Fast forward a couple of nights, and I was looking out of the lounge window that faces the old dirt road, and I saw about 3 cars with headlights and young men armed with rifles walking towards my woods, with grim, serious expressions on their faces. Judging by their sullen, determined looks, they meant business. I immediately confronted them, asking them what they were doing on my land, and they told me they'd come to take care of my Bigfoot problem. "My brother is lying in a hospital bed, seriously injured," the young man explained. "I cannot let that Bigfoot get away with what he's done to my brother. We are here to finish him off and get him back." "I cannot allow you to do that," I said. "You are putting yourselves in mortal danger. The Bigfoot will outsmart the lot of you, I can assure you." "There are 5 of us," said one of the youngsters, "and only 1 of him." "How do you know that?" I asked. The young men looked at each other in surprise, as if they'd never considered that there could potentially be more than 1 Bigfoot in my woods. "We are going," they insisted, "whether you like it or not." "You are trespassing on private land," I said. "You will end up getting hurt, and you have absolutely no idea what you're up against." I knew I was talking to a brick wall, because these young men were vehemently determined to pursue the Bigfoot. "All right," I said. "I'm calling the police and the ambulance, because you will get into all kinds of trouble if you get into those woods, and you'll be lucky if you live to see another day. Believe me, I've seen that Bigfoot in action, and he could eat the lot of you up for breakfast without any problems. You are no match for the likes of him." Finally, I thought I managed to persuade the young men to leave the Bigfoot alone, and I watched them get into their cars and finally drive away. I truly thought I'd seen the last of them. It was about 2 a.m. the following morning that I thought I heard gunshots in my woods, and I knew immediately that those young men had reneged on their promises and returned to pursue their attack on the Bigfoot, when they assumed that I had finally retired to bed. I groaned in horror, because against that phantom of the forest, these men were in mortal danger, and I knew that if they did not quit while they were ahead, they were dead men walking. I was just about to call the police when there was a loud banging on my door, and there were 5 men standing there shaking and quivering as they begged me to let me in. "Let us in," they cried. "Let us in. Please let us in." These young men were crying so much they looked like little children, as all their macho bravado had slipped away, revealing the raw terror that they were clearly feeling. I woke my wife up very quickly and asked him to make them mugs of hot chocolate with brandy in to counteract the shock that they were clearly feeling. "What happened?" I asked them. For a long while no one said a word. Then one of the young men finally spoke. "He knew," said the man. "Who knew what?" I asked. "The Bigfoot knew we were there to kill him. I am sure of it," he said. The others all nodded in agreement. "He did know," they said. "Go on," I urged them. "What happened, and where are your rifles?" "We went into the woods," said the one man, who was, with the help of a little brandy in his hot chocolate, had finally managed to gather some composure. "Go on," I encouraged. "We went into the woods," he repeated, "and then we heard the sound. It was a strange, humming, esoteric sound that I cannot describe because it was unlike anything I've ever heard before. We knew the noise was coming from the Bigfoot, that he was making the strange sound. I'm sure of it. It was hypnotic. It physically affected us, making our bodies feel uncoordinated and wobbly and causing us to become lightheaded. The next thing we knew was we were lying on the forest floor, waking up from a deep sleep, as if we'd come around from an anaesthetic after a long surgery. It felt like that." "Go on," I said, watching the young man bursting into tears. "I'm not a baby," he said, apologising profusely. "I never ever cry. But this creature, Well, he's not of this world. He has supernatural powers. He reads minds. As we came around from our sleep-like state, the Bigfoot stood there towering over us, with a look of intense hatred on his face. He had shredded our rifles to pieces and discarded all the bullets, almost as if he knew exactly what our ammo does and what the bullets actually are. How is that possible? I mean, he's only an animal, isn't he? He then roared at us and started chasing us out of the woods, and we all felt it screaming in our heads, saying, "Get out, or I will kill you, and leave my deer alone." You all heard it, I asked. The young men nodded. We all heard exactly the same words in our heads, but they were spoken in our heads and not audibly. "You see what I mean," said the man. "The creature is not of this world. No one can talk to you in your head like that. I mean, not without audible words." "I will tell you one thing," said the young man. "I admit I've been poaching for a while now in places all over West Virginia, and often I felt I was being watched. I'm never ever going to hunt again, not after what I've experienced tonight. My poaching days are well and truly behind me." "Well, that's a very good thing to hear. Poaching is a very senseless practice. You have your whole lives ahead of you. Do something good with them," I said. "In light of all the events that have occurred on my farm, I am now convinced that the phantom of the forest was indeed protecting the deer on my land. And this was confirmed to me one day later when I saw him coming out of the woods with 2 large deer walking beside him like obedient dogs, but I could tell they loved him and wanted to be with him. I believe he knew I was watching him, because his steely eyes glanced in my direction, and then he walked back into the forest on his agile legs, like he was floating, with the deer following behind him. I got the sense he was saying, 'I am here, watching over the forest and its creatures, and I will not take any nonsense from anyone. I have a responsibility to the animals of the woods.' To that end, this is my story. I did recently put a sign up outside my woods saying, 'Beware of the Bigfoot who eats poachers for breakfast,' and the sign appears to have done the trick, because I've seen no sight or sound of a poacher for a very long while. My daughter recently saw the Bigfoot on our land. She said there is a hairy monster on our property, taking a deer for a walk. I knew that she had seen the phantom of the woods. So there you are. That is my story."
Dear Sarah and all your listeners, my name is Susanna, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 1962 when I was a young girl of only 14 years old at the time. I'd rather not tell you whereabouts in North America this all transpired for the purposes of remaining anonymous, because the nature of my story is very strange and bizarre and certainly does not conform to the conventional title of a traditional Bigfoot encounter by any manner of means. For this reason, keeping my details secret is a very good idea as far as I'm concerned, but it doesn't make my story any less true. And whether you believe it is spurious or not is entirely up to you. Let's face it, every Bigfoot encounter is fictitious, because eyewitness accounts are not considered reliable enough, which is why Bigfoot still remains a cryptid, mythical-type creature. This is, of course, until documented science can finally prove that Bigfoot is true. Until then, he still remains a fabricated creature of fiction. For those of us who have physically seen him, we know that he's real. But until you've actually seen him yourself, you'll always be left wondering, asking, and maybe even doubting, and who can blame you for that? I most certainly don't. I grew up in a delightful rural setting where all the houses on our street were set against magnificent blue-grey mountains, emerald green rolling hills, rugged ridges and rocky outcrops, as well as vast areas of natural green resplendent forest that literally swept back for hundreds upon hundreds of miles. The houses in our street were all ranch style and painted in bright, flashy, cheerful colours, from bright pinks to mauves, purples, peaches, oranges, yellows, blues and even greens. Not like today, where house colours are much more plain, minimalistic, subdued and understated. The houses in those days possessed their own unique, charming, individualistic terraced gardens that were perfectly manicured and offset by stunning, colourful flowers in spring, summer and autumn. sumptuously perfectly mown green lawns as well. I lived in the smallest house on our street with my mother, but my mother's sister, Aunt Selina, lived only a few houses down in the largest, glitziest house on the street that was painted in a dazzling bright purple colour and was stunningly beautiful. Neither my aunt or my mother had ever been married, so I was raised just by my mother, and I was told that she had no recollection of who my father actually was, and that was something that infuriated me a great deal growing up, as you can imagine. How I longed for a father, and I truly envied my friends who grew up with their mother and father in what I considered to be a stereotypical, normal, quintessential family home. When I expressed my misgivings and reservations about not having a normal family to my mother, she would always say, "What is normal? There is no such thing as normal. Every family has its idiosyncrasies. You mark my words, dear. On the outside, things may look normal, but on the inside, it's a very different story altogether. There is no such thing as normal. That idea is complete fallacy," she'd say. My mother worked as a nurse at the local hospital, where she engaged in night shift duties looking after the very sick people. It was on those nights that I was left to go and stay with my Aunt Selina, which was usually one night a week. Aunt Selina was a very peculiar, eccentric woman who was always attired in long, flowing, bright-coloured clothes and wore hundreds of bright beads on her neck. She had a long mane of grey hair, which she wore back in a very severe tight bun, and she had very dark brown eyes and a long pointed beak-like nose. On the side of her cheek she had a pair of long cat's whiskers that grew out of a large black mole that I always secretly longed to pluck with a pair of sharp tweezers, but never actually had the courage to do so. I never enjoyed going to stay at Aunt Selina's because there was something about her that set my nerves on edge. In truth, she gave me the creeps, and in her presence I was never completely at ease. Another thing that bothered me was that there was a room in the corner of her kitchen that looked very much like a large pantry. It appeared to be bolted up with a double padlock and was out of bounds to everyone, and it seemed incredibly strange to me that she was hiding something. I was sure of that, and I would always wonder what it was that she was hiding. One day the answer was revealed to me, and imagine my shock and horror when I discovered my aunt's deep, dark secret that she had been hiding from us for so many long years. It all happened when I arrived at Aunt Selina's home a couple of hours too impetuously. I was going to be spending the night at her house on that evening, as my mother was on night shift. I entered my aunt's large, spacious kitchen and could see her through the large kitchen window, busying herself in the yard. She was wearing a wide-brimmed summer hat and a pair of green gardening gloves, and was bustling around with a trowel in her hand, busying herself with some compost in the vegetable patch, as she was planting seedlings like lettuce, carrots, and tomatoes. I was just about to go and greet her and say hello, but she was seemingly so preoccupied and distracted by her digging, and I realised she hadn't actually noticed me standing there in her kitchen. I suddenly noticed that the bolted door of the secret room in the corner of her kitchen was lying half open, and the heavy padlock was lying on the kitchen table. My aunt had failed to lock it behind her, and I knew in that moment that this was my perfect opportunity to unravel the mystery that lay behind that bolted door. I could not overcome the desperate nagging desire and insatiable curiosity to go into that room. It was an urge that I could not suppress. I looked out of the kitchen window and could see that my aunt was still deeply entrenched in planting some seedlings in the vegetable patch, so this was my perfect moment to do a little snooping. Little did I realise that I was to uncover something that would quite literally shake me to the core. I was to realise that my aunt lived a duplicitous double life. To the outside world she was Selina Roxburgh, but the secret, mysterious, deep, dark world that she actually inhabited was an insidious one of gods, goddesses, spells, potions, and magic. You see, it appeared that Aunt Selina was some kind of a witch, and she was part of a coven in a small little innocent American town, of whom some of the residents were also deeply entrenched in the surreptitious, Machiavellian, and highly deceptive world. The secret room I'd entered was like entering a viper's nest, because I realised that if Aunt Selina knew I'd discovered her dirty secret,
I would end up in serious trouble. Well, so I thought. I mean, would I want to experience the wrath of a real-life witch? Somehow I doubted it very much. On the left-hand side of my aunt's room was a huge leather-bound book with titles such as Sacrificial Offerings to the Gods and Goddesses, Hexes and Curses, Spells and Rituals, Occult Secrets and Mysteries, the Book of Shadows, and How to Run Your Own Witch's Coven. I promise you, reading these strange esoteric titles on her books made my blood run cold. Growing up, I'd always believed that witches, warlocks and wizards were the stuff of children's fairy tales, but by the look of my aunt's secret room, I could tell that she was definitely involved in the occult and witchcraft of some kind. This revelation was disturbingly horrifying to me, as all my worst fears about my aunt's life, were finally confirmed. There was a huge leather-bound black diary on a large desk, and it was marked Friday the 13th at 12 p.m. at the Pine Needles, offerings to gods and goddesses. Then there were the 5 names of women who I knew lived in our local town, all who were the oddbells and misfits of our local community, whom had possibly found my aunt's friendship a beguiling lure. Were they all secret members of this witch's coven, I wondered to myself in horror and amazement, all at the same time. I noticed a large book on my aunt's desk that was bookmarked, and I opened the page which read, Worshipping the Gods and Goddesses. It is good to show thanks and gratitude to the gods and goddesses with large bowls of fruit and nuts, bunches of flowers and black candles. This is beneficial to the coven, bringing bountiful blessings your way, for thankfulness brings its due rewards. I knew that the Pine Needles was one of the wooded areas on the left-hand side of the street, which was a favourite day and spot for many of the locals to frequent during the day, to take their dogs for walks, or to have a picnic by the stream that meandered through the pretty wooded area. It was also a wonderful retreat for the white-tailed deer, mule deer and elk to congregate for a refreshing cool summer drink. Now I realized it was also a site for more nefarious activities that took place during the witching hours of the night, while the rest of the community slept. I looked around the room to see if there was anything else of interest, but apart from a box of black candles and some peculiar bottles of strange herbs, and a large black witch's cloak hanging on a hook on the inside door, there was literally nothing else of significant interest. So I quickly retreated from the room, leaving everything as I'd found it, and went out to greet my aunt. In the days that followed, I could not think of anything else but the insidious double life that Aunt Selina led. The thought of her operating as a witch in the dark hours of the night was not a pretty thought, and quite literally left me feeling very rattled and on edge. I did ask my mother some probing questions, like if she believed that there could be witches practicing their arts in the 1960s, and my mother laughed out loud and said, "Oh dear, you do have your head in the clouds sometimes. No, there is no such thing as witches and warlocks in our day and age," she assured me. What a very strange question to ask me. She continued, "In the olden days, people were falsely accused of witchcraft and hung at the stake, like the Salem witch trials of 1692, where 20 people were executed for being witches. But no, those things don't exist today. But they do play a crucial part in myths and legends and fairy tales, and of course riveting children's stories, not to mention Halloween and other kiddies' events." "Are you sure?" I asked. "You don't think that Aunt Selina could surreptitiously be a witch? She has a huge hairy mole on her cheek, and a pointed nose, and very hawk-like eyes, and she's a very creepy woman." My mother hooted with laughter. "Selina, a witch," she joked. "Never in a million years, dear. Just because you think your aunt has a witch-like appearance does not make her a witch, any more than me doing a few pirouettes and a few pliés makes me a prima ballerina. No, she's definitely not a witch." "What if she's got some books on the occult and dark arts?" I suggested. "What then?" "Well, your aunt is a little eccentric, let's not kid," said my mother. "She's interested in unusual phenomena, but what's wrong with that? It does not surprise me if she's got some unusual books hanging around, but she certainly isn't a witch."
Now, my suggestion to you, dear, is to stop filling your head with all these crazy ideas about your poor Aunt Selina. I'm sure she would be mortified to hear you talking about her in this light." I was not sure that my mother was actually right. I did not have the heart to mention to her the secret bolted room in my aunt's kitchen corner that was filled with all kinds of strange mystical books on witchcraft and spells. If there was really nothing to the story, why was my aunt hiding these things behind bolted doors, I wondered. Had not my mother always taught me, growing up, that you have nothing to hide if you have nothing to hide? It was then that I came to the decision that on Friday the 13th, I would be going to the Pine Needle Woods myself to see what was going on with my Aunt Selina. I needed to find answers to my questions. I would hide behind a tree and see what happened, I thought. Then I would be able to decide for myself whether Aunt Selina was actually a witch or not, and whether she was a leader of a witch's coven, or whether she was just simply a crazy, loopy woman with bizarre and fanciful ideas about becoming a witch. And so it was. I was awoken to the sound of my alarm at 11 p.m. on Friday the 13th. I groaned as I got up out of bed, wondering if this plan of mine was a good idea after all. I hoped that the buzzing sound of my alarm clock hadn't woken my mother, but she did remain fast asleep. I could hear her quiet snores down the passageway. I quickly dressed, put on some clothes and a pair of sneakers, and gathered a flashlight, and off I trotted to the pine woods, to take care to be as quiet as possible so as not to awaken the entire neighbourhood. As strange as this sounded, I actually felt a flurry of excitement, because in my heart I really sensed something extraordinary was about to happen. Little did I know that the extraordinary things that were about to unfold this night would have me asking questions for many years to come, until one day, out of the blue, the answer would come to me like the light suddenly shining in a dark room, divulging every single secret. I have never been to the Pine Needle Woods late at night before, but it was intriguing to be out this late. It was a dusky night with the pearly light of a glistening half-moon and a scattering of pretty stars that glistened like pretty jewelled diamonds in the vast firmament. It really was a magnificent night, I thought to myself. As I entered the woods, I could smell the evocative aroma of pine needles under my feet and the strong, intoxicating smell of jasmine. I was surprised how incredibly quiet it was, which did leave me with an uneasy feeling. I could not hear the usual sounds of frogs croaking and the chorus of the crickets and the hoots of the owls, sounds that I was well acquainted with living in the country, so I did find the absence of these sounds decidedly odd and very disconcerting. I was not sure which was the best place for me to hide, but I assumed that if there was going to be some kind of a witch's ritual, it would need to be done in the larger clearing in the middle of the woods that was close to the proximity to the gushing stream. I found myself the perfect spot behind a large towering oak tree, and then I watched, counting the minutes by every second with my watch. It was 2 minutes to 12 when I suddenly heard the sounds of esoteric chanting and humming, and then I saw them. There were 6 shadowy dark forms, all wearing long black cloaks with hoods that covered their heads. In the darkness of the night, they did look ominously menacing and satanic, as their dark robes flowed in the gentle breeze. They were all carrying lanterns in their hands that succeeded in brightening up the whole clearing in a gentle light. Then I saw one of the figures pull back the hood of her cloak, and I could see that it was Aunt Selina. She instructed everybody to sit in a circle, and then with a match she proceeded to light up hundreds of black candles that were propped up in candle holders that were scattered over the entire clearing. I assumed she must have placed them there earlier in the day in anticipation of her ritual. Suddenly the whole clearing was illuminated by this soft, gentle, flickering light of her pretty candles. Once again the chanting continued, and then my aunt raised her arms above her head and started speaking in some strange Latin-sounding language that I could not comprehend, and then suddenly she started to speak English. "Gods and goddesses," she said, "we humble ourselves before you on this night. We bring you our sacrificial gifts to honour you and give you thanks for the changing of the seasons, for the rising of the sun and for the setting of the moon. We give you thanks for the waters from the heavens and the warmth of the sun that brings us food to our tables and strength and nourishment to our bodies." Aunt Selina then went over to the large oversized suitcase that she had clearly brought into the woods earlier in the day and proceeded to unlock it. She then took out the most enormous bowls of fruit, nuts and flowers, and every one of the hooded figures came to retrieve their own individual gifts, and they were to present to the gods and goddesses. Finally, they pulled back their hoods to reveal their faces, and I recognized the ladies as the oddballs of our local community. I watched in stunned amazement as they kneeled down and then kissed the earth with their lips and presented their gifts at the base of a very large oak tree while they continued to chant. Then my aunt got out 7 silver goblets and raised up a bottle of wine to the heavens. "We drink the blood of the grape, the fruit of the vine, to honour all the gods and goddesses." "To honour the gods and goddesses," they all chorused. "To honour the gods and goddesses." They started to toast and raise glasses, and their lips became stained by the deep red wine which they drained in their mouths until their goblets were dry. My aunt, then picking up a loose tree branch, proceeded to bang the side of a large oak tree 3 times, hitting it very hard so that it made a loud banging sound. "We honour you," she said, and all the women chanted after her, "We honour you, we honour you." My aunt then banged the side of the tree 3 more times. "We honour you, gods and goddesses." Once again, all 5 women chanted, "We honour you, gods and goddesses. We honour you, gods and goddesses." Suddenly the most extraordinary thing happened. There were 3 loud tree knocks that sounded as if they were coming from somewhere very close by, almost as a direct response to my aunt's knocks. My aunt's little witch's coven appeared to be getting very, very excited. "The gods have answered us," said one of the ladies, her whole face flashing with excitement. "The gods have answered us. This is amazing." They all chorused in rapturous exuberance. "This is amazing." Suddenly there was a sound of something thunderous racing through the woods, and it appeared to be bolting at 100 miles an hour, sounding ominously like a herd of rhinos crashing through the undergrowth and coming towards us. "It's the gods and goddesses," said my aunts. "Get down on your knees, everybody. Surrender to the mighty ones in an act of humility and worship now." All 6 cloaked figures obediently fell to their knees, with their upper torsos bent over the ground in an act of submissive worship. Then I saw him, a creature the likes of such that I have never seen before in my life. This colossal creature was quite literally Herculean in size. He was majestic, lofty, powerful, and imposing. This extraordinary ape-like humanoid towered at about 10 feet off the ground, but it was his girth that impressed me the most, because he was about 5 feet wide, was thick, brawny, and muscular. His whole body, from head to toe, was covered in waves of thick, long, lustrous black hair, and his arms were so long they could almost touch his ankles without bending over. I was amazed to observe that the shoulders on this creature were humongous, as they supported a very large cone-shaped head. I was fascinated to see that his long face seemed to possess a combination of human and ape-like influences, with a very deep-set pair of treacle-brown eyes and a very prominent brow ridge, slender mouth, and flat nose. I was fortunate to see the detail of this creature so clearly under the light of the lanterns and the enchanting candlelight. I truly should have been trembling in my boots in an act of unadulterated terror, as most people invariably would have been. However, I was so astounded and I gasped by what I was actually seeing, and so impressed by the creature's magnificence, that for a while it would seem that my terror and fear were momentarily suppressed by my complete awe and approbation for this remarkable, awesome creature. Yet I assure you, I was in absolutely no doubt that this creature was highly dangerous and exceedingly formidable, and like any apex predator, demanded respect, and to fear him would be the wisest course of action you could make. The creature seemed surprised to see all 6 of these cloaked women bowing down before him, believing him to be some kind of a god who had responded to their offerings. I believe for this hairy humanoid, seeing these women like this in such a passive, submissive role, made him feel quite smugly satisfied, and also pleased that he wasn't actually being challenged. He proceeded to make a few grunting sounds, and then he started pounding his chest as if to say, "I'm glad you acknowledge my superiority and magnificence over you." Truly, he seemed so pleased by the bended knees and the lowered heads. Suddenly he perceived all the offerings lying at the base of the oak tree. He took the flowers and disposed of them across the forest floor with incredibly little interest in them, as if their delicate beauty had all but escaped him. When he saw the huge bowls of fruit and nuts, he allowed the huge, powerful, testosterone-driven male bravado to slip away, and he quite suddenly became like a naughty, mischievous monkey who could not wait to dive into the goodies. Even I was smiling as I saw this complete transformation in the creature's personality that quite literally went from dominance to childlike whimsical exuberance in a matter of seconds. Judging by the sheer delight on his face, you would have thought all his Christmases had come at once. He quite literally looked thrilled and ecstatic, and eagerly popped a couple of juicy strawberries into his mouth, making an appreciative oohing and ahhing sound as he proceeded to carry the large bowls of fruit away. I watched in stupefied awe as he glided back into the woods on his long, agile legs, and then I could hear him whistling all the way. He was one big, happy bundle of hair. That's all I can say. Once the creature had actually gone, all 6 women were weeping, including my aunt. I realized suddenly that they were crying tears of joy. "The gods answered us!" cried my Aunt Selina in delight. "The gods answered us! Isn't this the most wonderful thing that has ever happened to you? The gods took on human form and came to get our gifts. Do you realize what an honor this is for us?" she declared in ecstatic enthusiasm. One of the ladies was quick to point out that the gods had not been very interested in the flowers, but had shown a great deal of enthusiasm and eagerness for the fruit and the nuts. "I think the gods are not at all pleased with our flowers," she said, pointing to the flower heads whose petals were sprinkled over the forest floor in clouds of confetti. Fast forward a few weeks, and I told my mother about our nightly adventure in the woods. I revealed to her how Aunt Selina and her so-called coven of witches had bowed down before this hairy humanoid ape, believing him to be some kind of a god. They had not realized that they were bowing down to this massive black bipedal ape, who was anything but a god, and had only appeared as a response to some wood-knocking that Aunt Selina had performed as part of her dubious ritual. "Mum, he was titanic in size," I told her, "and unlike anything I've ever seen in my entire life, because, believe me, he was flesh and blood, and was definitely not supernatural." "How extraordinary," said my mother. "I wonder what kind of creature he actually is." "I believe that you saw him, because over the years I've heard whooping sounds coming from the pine needles, and I always knew in my heart that there was some kind of primate living out there. So it doesn't surprise me at all that you encountered such an intriguing, mystical creature. I'm surprised you weren't absolutely terrified." "I think I was too shocked to be afraid," I told her. "I couldn't believe what I was actually seeing, and he was so magnificent. I was more in awe of him than afraid. But if I'd been close up to him, I would have been absolutely terrified. I would have bolted away as fast as I could. I mean, he was very scary looking and very daunting and intimidating. Close up, anybody would do their nut." "What about Aunt Selina? Was she afraid?" asked my mother. "No, because she thought he was a god of some kind, so she was bowing down to the creature on the forest floor, and none of the women looked up, not even once. They were totally submissive. If they had, they would have screamed in terror. I am certain of that." "Well, that had to be a good thing," said my mother. "I do know that acting submissive with apes curtails any desire for them to become aggressive." "But, Mum, what about Aunt Selina?" I said. "She's a real live witch in charge of a coven. Are you not going to stop her from dabbling with something as evil and as heinous as witchcraft? Surely you must." "Darling, don't judge your aunt. She's only having a little fun. And don't condemn her for the choices she makes. Condemn not, lest you be condemned. We all play our part in the game of life, and judging by your Aunt Selina, it's not the worst thing that she could possibly do. Just let her be herself. I'm sure she'll find her way somewhere down the road. My mother was right. Selina went through many strange metamorphoses in her life. She went from being a witch to being a Buddhist, then she went travelling around the world, then she became a teacher, and then finally a missionary. So the game of life took her on a very exciting and interesting journey. It was only in 2006 that I was to discover that the creature I encountered all those years ago in the woods as a 14-year-old girl was in fact a Bigfoot, a Yeti, a Sasquatch, or a hairy man. I found this out when my mother and I were watching a program on TV called Finding Bigfoot, and then I remember jumping up and down with absolute delight when I realised that this was indeed the creature that I'd seen in the Pine Needle Woods. I was amazed how I'd encountered the creature in such unusual circumstances when my aunt had fancied herself as the head of a witch's coven. I truly believe things could have panned out very differently if she and her friends had not been in such a submissive position in front of this great creature. I still cannot forget how completely joyous, whimsical and childlike the creature became when he was confronted by bowls of the most delectable fruits and nuts. I truly believe he thought he had died and gone to heaven 100 times over, and that Christmas had come early. I think he must have forgotten all those weird cloaked figures on their knees in the forest floor as he eagerly trotted away with all his mouth-watering treats. There you are. I warned you my story was super weird, but weird things often happen when you encounter the hairy man, and invariably it will only ever happen when you least expect it. So there you are. That's my story. I mean, isn't that absolutely true? What a fabulous story. I do want to say that I hear this over and over again, that it's usually the most bizarre circumstances that actually lead to a Bigfoot encounter. And people often, when they actually go looking for a Bigfoot, they never find one. It's almost like the Bigfoot knows what they're planning to do and doesn't reveal himself to them. It does seem to be that when people are on their own, or when they're least expecting it, or perhaps they're very joyous or very sad, that seems to be when Bigfoot will show his face. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I have 2 very airy encounters that happened to me. One was supernatural, and the other was related to the hairy man, otherwise known as Bigfoot, and in a strange, curious, rather peculiar way, you could say that they happened simultaneously, well, more or less. My story begins in the early June of 2003, when my mother was purchasing a rather grand property that was one of 17 other homes in a private cul-de-sac in a very upmarket, serene neighbourhood. The old Victorian-style houses had all but been bulldozed and replaced with these new Tuscan 2-storey homes that were open plan, very palatial and very grand and spacious. It was conveniently located in the countryside, with the nearest town only 20 minutes away, so it really was rather idyllic. To access the property, you would drive through this beautifully stunning landscaped stone entrance with a large backdrop of towering, majestic, mature oak trees and plenty of acres of emerald green space that you could explore, including a secluded wooded area of natural wilderness and beautiful tall trees that they were considering actually bulldozing in the not-too-distant future with the intention of building new homes there, rather like the Tuscan development that we were moving into. My mother had purchased the property on the spot, as she was an impulsive buyer, and she claimed to have fallen in love with the place at first sight. My father had little say in the matter, so what my mother wanted she invariably always got, and she ruled our house with an iron rod. I still remember the day I moved into the house as if it was yesterday. I was 18 at the time, and my brother Chris was only 16. The moment our white Mercedes-Benz pulled up to the property, my mother was literally oohing and ahhing about how magnificently palatial it all was and how impressed all her friends were going to be. But my father and I, we never said a word. We sat there in silence. I do not know how to explain this to you, but the place, although rich and grand and luxurious, was both menacing, cold and creepy. and I got the very strange impression that something or someone was watching us from the second-story window, and the energy they appeared to exude was ominous and oppressive, like a dark, heavy, depressed thunder cloud that retains all its watery sorrows. I regarded the uncomfortable expression on my poor father's face, and I knew almost immediately that he felt it too. "Isn't it absolutely magnificent?" my mother enthused, and I could see my poor father plant a plastic, somewhat erroneous smile on his poor face and try to look as excited as he could, but it was a very big struggle for him. "Lovely, dear," he said in a very flat voice. The removal van arrived and proceeded to place our furniture in strategic areas around the lavish mansion, under the direct supervision of my excitable mother, who ordered everyone around like a formidable headmistress, and you could see she was in her element. I heard one of the removal men say to his friend, "There is something not right about this home. It feels very haunted." The other guy nodded. "It gives me the creeps. It's got such a heavy, sinister vibe about it." I was gratified to hear an outside authority share their same misgivings about the place, confirming to myself that I wasn't completely barking mad, and that other people had physically sensed the negative energy of this place. I started to unpack my boxes in my room, which was the room with the most unwelcome ambience in the entire house. It was an energy of such deep, formidable hopelessness and despair, and it enveloped me with an icy frostiness that literally caused my entire body to shiver with the cold. My mother emerged in the room like a bright butterfly landing on a block of ice. Her joyful countenance was filled with exuberant enthusiasm and colourful energy, as she boldly declared how perfectly wonderful my cold, austere bedroom actually was. My mother rambled on and on and on about all the accessories she planned to use to transform my room into a bright, brash, pink princess bedroom. In truth, I barely heard a word she said. All I could think about was that there definitely was an unseen presence in my bedroom that was so palpable I could feel it. It was so real. It felt as if someone had actually died in my bedroom, and not too far away. It felt as if maybe they had died in the more recent Victorian development that preceded this new development that we were now actually living in. I was almost 100% certain that this was indeed the case. It had to be. Nothing else made any sense. After all, did not all land hold on to energy signatures of previously deceased tenants or owners? I was almost certain that was true. "Lisa, are you listening?" asked my mother with a look of infuriation on her highly made-up face. "Who did you say lived here before when it was a Victorian home?" I asked her. "I've no idea, darling. You do ask the strangest questions sometimes." I did notice that from the moment we moved into our home, curiously strange and peculiar things began to happen very, very suddenly, and even my somewhat bemused, rather insensitive mother did start to notice them too. "Who keeps taking my car keys out of my handbag and putting them into the freezer?" she would ask. "It's not funny," she said, eyeing my brother with a look of suspicion on her face. Other strange things happened too, like we would smell cigarette smoke wafting in the house, and my mother was absolutely convinced my brother was secretly smoking behind her back. She was furious with him. "I told you, I cannot abide such a disgusting, vile and revolting habit," she would say. "Mum, I'm not smoking," protested my brother innocently. "Don't lie to me," scolded my mother. Then there was a time that my mother found a large handprint on her chocolate mousse that was setting in the fridge, and once again she hurled her accusations at my brother, reprimanding him ever so severely. "What is it about you? Since we've moved into this house, you are hiding all my things, smoking cigarettes behind my back, ruining all my beautiful, delicious puddings. You're deliberately trying to annoy me and make me very upset. It's like you're contemptuously ridiculing me and getting your kicks out of it at my expense. I assure you, I am not amused by any of this." As my brother was protesting his innocence, Suddenly we heard a loud, audible chuckle. And it was not coming from any of us, let me tell you. My mother looked incensed and stormed out of the room, incandescent with rage. "You kids and all your pranks, you're wearing me down," she snapped. "I've just had about enough as I can take of the lot of you." I did try to tell my mother that there was a ghostly presence in our house that was just toying with her, but she told me that I was barking mad and that there was no such things as ghosts. "Tell them, dear," she said, looking at my father. As usual, my father was as quiet as a church mouse, but just to appease my mother and to keep the peace, he did his dutiful duty, as was always the case. "Your mother's very right. There is nothing here." But the expression on his face did tell a very different story. One night I was returning to bed with a cup of cocoa in my hands when I smelt the very distinct odour of cigarette smoke. I almost choked because it was so strong. The door to my bedroom was ajar, and then I saw him. There was a young man, possibly about 18 or so, with short, spiky brown hair, wearing a green plaid shirt, sitting on the edge of my bed, smoking a cigarette. I even remember the pout to his lips when he blew out the whirls of white smoke into long tunnels of curly smoke. I did not know if the young man knew that I was there in those first few seconds, that I stood just gaping at him. I could hardly believe what I was actually witnessing with my eyes. For a moment it was as if time just stood still. And then he looked up, and our eyes met. And he smiled, and then in a flash he was gone, just like that. It happened so incredibly quickly. One moment he was there, and then he was gone. But the smell of pungent cigarette still lingered after him in the air. I bolted down the stairs as fast as I possibly could to tell my mother that I'd seen a ghost, and she became enraged and told me to stop telling Porky Pies. When she did this, there was another out-of-worldly chuckle. But my mother thought it was me laughing at her. She became furious and told me to stop messing around with her and making up all these ghost stories to scare her. "This is a new housing development," she scolded. "If it were ghosts were real, they certainly wouldn't be hanging around a brand new place like this." And then I heard another chuckle. That night I went to bed, absolutely terrified. I was so frightened that that ghost would reappear again. I knew he was harmless, but I was not comfortable seeing something supernatural in my home, let alone my bedroom. And besides, I had heard horrible stories before about ghosts turning nasty or not being what they first appeared to be. The next evening, when I was in the adjoining bathroom brushing my teeth, my mother came into my bedroom with a cup of cocoa in her hands, and sitting on the bed was the male ghost smoking a cigarette. I heard a crashing sound as my mother dropped the cocoa that she had for me in utter horror on the floor. I came out of the bathroom and I saw that she had locked eyes with the ghost. The look of terror on my mother's face was literally unforgettable. I do not think she could believe what she was actually seeing. The ghost made a chuckling sound and then was gone in a flash of light, and my mother started to scream. "Ah!" Long after the ghost had vaporized, she was still screaming. "Ah!" My mother wasted no time in calling over a paranormal team to eliminate the ghost immediately, and the paranormal investigator told her that to get rid of ghosts was not the same as getting rid of rodents or rats or roaches, and that things needed to be done much more sensitively than that. My mother told the team to leave because she wanted our ghost gone as soon as was conceivably possible, and if they couldn't get rid of it now, then she would call someone else. And that's what she did. That was when she called the help of a well-known psychic, a lady by the name of Cynthia. The lady arrived very promptly, and my mother literally ordered her to get rid of the ghost immediately. "He must be gone," she insisted. "How am I ever going to be able to shower again with him loitering around the place? For all I know, he may be a peeping Tom, and he may have been watching and spying on me all the time while I was getting dressed. At this rate, I will never be able to change my clothes ever again. I will end up smelling like a skunk. But I may never be able to bath with him around. I have no intention of being eye candy for a ghost." "I'm sure it will not come to that," said the psychic very kindly to my mother. "I'm sure we can get him to leave, but we need to find out why he's here in the first place." The psychic managed to connect with the ghost, who told her that his name was Christopher and that he had lived in the old Victorian house only a few years prior, before it had been bulldozed and transformed into a new development. He said he had hung himself in the closet and his mother had returned home to find him hanging there, and he was so torn up about what he'd done, with so much guilt and regret because he'd caused her so much devastating pain. He had tried to reach out to her, but she had been so full of grief that she had failed to see him, and he wanted her to know that he was so sorry at what he'd done and that he really loved her, and that he wanted her to know this before he actually moved on into the next world. And so it was the psychic did contact the previous owner of the former woman who lived in the house and passed over the message to the young woman, who was so happy to get the message. Then she proceeded to cleanse our home by smoking our entire home with sage, but everything she did just could not convince my mother that the ghost had actually gone. So she would go to her local health club and have showers there, because she was absolutely convinced that the Snoopy ghost was still around. While she was at her health club, she met a lady who informed her that salt needed to be placed on every corner of the property to keep the ghost at bay. And I kid you not, the back of my mother's car boot was literally loaded and packed with hundreds and hundreds of bags of salt. And I was the one relegated to putting salt around every area of the premises, much to the annoyance of the landscape gardeners, who asked me what on earth I was doing with all these massive amounts of salt. I did tell them I was getting rid of a ghost in our house, and they both cracked up laughing. It was on a Friday afternoon that, armed with a few kilos of salt, I entered the wooded area, and I was impressed by how magnificently beautiful it was, as there were towering mature oaks, maples and pine trees, and they were so majestic and beautiful. I could detect all kinds of animal scat on the forest floor, which I knew suggested that this magical place was indeed a haven for all kinds of wild animals, which was a very exciting thought. I could not help thinking that it would be a travesty to tear down this glorious forest to make way for a brand new development. A chipmunk was watching me with a curious interest as I ventured deeper into the forest. Suddenly I noticed some tree branches had been twisted into circular shapes and at peculiar angles, and it looked very strange and rather menacing. I didn't know what it could be, but I was quite interested. After a while I heard a very strange sound in the woods, and the only way I can describe it was that it sounded like a dog was rolling around in the grass. I moved towards the curious noise, and I saw what I thought looked like a bear rolling on its back, which it was rubbing vigorously on the forest floor, almost like it was giving itself a lovely, long, sensuous body scrub. I realized suddenly that this creature was not a bear at all, because it had long, hairy, black arms with dark hands and flat human-like nails, and the hair-covered body was very colossal, much larger than that of a black bear. What on earth was this curious, strange thing, I wondered, that was behaving exactly like a dog and clearly enjoying himself very much? Suddenly I wanted to sneeze, and I was absolutely mortified because I did not want this creature to see me, standing right there. But out came my sneeze in full force, possibly due to my hay fever, and it was beyond my control. The creature sat up and looked around with a concerned look in its deep-set brown eyes, and bounced up immediately on its long, agile legs, fixing a steely gaze upon me. I could see by his pained expression on his leathery brown face that he was not at all happy that I had observed him like this, and that he had been caught off guard.
I stood there in terror regarding this creature, in utter horror. I promise you, being close to a creature as imposing and as powerful as this thing was like being in a tiger's den. You pretty much think you're already living on borrowed time and that death is imminent. In that moment, I did not know whether to run or to stand still. I have never been more afraid in my entire life, and my legs were shaking violently beneath me, and my heart was thundering through my chest at 100 miles an hour. The creature looked at me, curled back his mouth, exposing his glistening white, pearly teeth, and made a strange, audible, growling sound that sounded very menacing, like an aggressive Rottweiler dog. And then he gave me 1 or 2 more glances with his brown eyes and ran off on his long, hairy legs with the most incredible agility and grace. I was so relieved to see the creature go, but I could not believe what my eyes had physically seen. This creature must have been about 7 to 8 feet tall, 500 to 600 pounds, and covered with long, lustrous black hair, and it was rather matted, but it had a face that was just like that of an ape, but also human influences in it, and a very distinctive, very crinkled brow ridge, a dark, flat nose, and a typical ape-like mouth. I ran back to my mother as fast as I could to tell her what I'd seen. "Mum, there's an ape man in the woods, and he was rolling on the ground just like a dog. There was an ape in the woods, Mum, and he was like a dog rolling in the ground." "Lisa, what's wrong with you?" my mother shrieked. "Stop making up these crazy stories. There are no apes in America, for goodness sake. Why do you insist on trying to scare your poor mother? It's amazing that I've not had a cardiac arrest with all the comings and goings lately. Did you put the salt on the edges of the woods, or did you not?" she asked, looking at me with a very suspicious look on her face. "Of course I did," I said, knowing full well that I hadn't. What was the point of putting kilos and kilos of salt in their packages all around the forest floor? But what my mother did not know was not going to hurt her, because layering salt everywhere was not going to ward off ghosts, in my opinion. I was sad that I could not share my amazing encounter with the ape-like humanoid that I'd met in the woods, because no one believed my story, and even my own brother, who knows I do not lie, just refused to believe me, and told me that after my encounter with the ghost, I was now seeing things and manifesting them in my imagination, which definitely was not the case. I know what I saw in those woods, and it was a hairy, ape-like humanoid. I kid you not, days after my mother's encounter with a ghost, despite the fact that the house felt light and airy, and there were no ghostly pranks being performed anymore, and no strange laughter in the house, none of that mattered. My mother was totally convinced that the ghost was hiding in her closet, eager to watch her getting dressed. I did try and tell my mother that I knew that he was gone, but the more I insisted that she had nothing to worry about, the more contrary my mother became, insisting that she had sensed that the ghost was spying on her and was hiding in her closet, convinced that he was following her to the health club as well. She told us that while she was washing her hair in the shower, the shampoo bottle had mysteriously fallen over, and she ran out of the shower screaming, believing that the ghost had been in the shower with her. She did call the psychic to investigate the shower at the health club, much to the manager's disapproval and horror of all the gym members. The psychic assured her that the ghost had well and truly gone and had not followed her to the gym, but my mother insisted that the psychic saged the whole shower area, including the shower that she had been in. When some of the ladies looked shocked about the lengths my mother was going to, my mother informed the bystanders that they should be grateful because she was eliminating an invisible peeping Tom from the premises. And so it was my mother put our property on the market all over again, and we moved into a rented property until my mother found us another home, and she also found a new health club that she was certain was no longer haunted by the peeping Tom. I'm glad to report that there has been no paranormal activity in our new place that we bought. It was a few years after that I was to discover that the extraordinary creature I had seen in the woods was actually a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, and I was amazed that there were people like me who had reported sightings of this unusual creature, so I was not completely alone
in my experience, I am glad to say. But before we settle down, the story tonight is very interesting because it comes from a lady who is in fact a famous author from the 1980s period. And she doesn't want to give her details about who she is because she is famous. But she did have a Bigfoot encounter, which you're going to find really fascinating. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Petunia. It's not really, of course, but for the purposes of this story, I do fancy a rather flowery name for myself. I do need to remain anonymous because I'm a very well-known novelist from the 80s period, which means I'd like my letters to contain as little factual details as possible. I would like to admit such details like where I'm from, and even the place where I actually had my Bigfoot encounter, which occurred in the spring of 1987. I've always been a prolific writer, much to the delight and enthusiasm of my publishers, as the ideas would just flow like a never-ending stream of gushing water. That is, unfortunately, when the creative sparkle in my life just suddenly diminished in the January of 1987, and this means I just hit a brick wall and simply could not write anymore. The term for this is known as writer's block, and for the first time in my life I literally found myself being hounded and harassed by my publisher, telling me to get a move on with my story, but try as I might, I simply could not put pen to paper, much to my great consternation. I remember one morning in January when it was very cold and chilly out there, and the previous evening we had actually had some frozen rain, sleet and snow. It was then that I decided I would gallantly brace the elements and take my 4-month-old German Shepherd for a walk. In my experience, nothing gets the creative juices flowing more than a walk and fresh air, and at this stage I was so desperate I was willing to try anything to get that inspiration going. My imagination had become as dry as a barrel, a colossal-sized stumbling block for any aspiring novelist, let me assure you. Bear in mind that I live in a residential area where the neighbours are not too far apart, and I'm fortunate enough to live in a pretty cul-de-sac with beautiful terraced gardens, perfectly manicured hedges, and lawns with bountiful beds bursting with colourful blooms in every available colour, from pinks to lilacs, yellows, reds and oranges. I proceeded to walk my shepherd puppy, who was a little anxious of experiencing this brand new world outside our safe little property, with the seemingly endless lawns of green grass, unusual smells, and the sounds of dogs barking everywhere. I went over to our neighbour's friendly white husky and introduced him to my little Juno through the large white steel gate, and the encounter was a lot more aggressive than I had envisaged. I hastily guided Juno away from the excitable, temperamental dog, who was now barking furiously. I scurried away, guiltily aware that I had probably awoken the entire neighbourhood at the early hours of the morning, with this huge raucous commotion, but things were about to get a lot worse. Suddenly I went skidding and skating down the concrete embankment and reached out with my right hand to break the fall. I luckily landed on my bum, but my wrist did not escape the harrowing effects of the nasty fall. I let out the most horrendous, agonizing scream because the pain I was experiencing was like nothing I have ever experienced in my life, as excruciating shooting pains and terrible throbbing aches engulfed my entire body. I knew I'd broken my wrist badly, but visually seeing this gruesome, disturbing sight of my limp hand dangling off the end of my wrist with a little sinew and jagged bone protruding from the convoluted flesh was even more terrifying than the pain itself. I howled in absolute agony, hoping that I had awakened one of my neighbours, but my scream was not answered and was met with still silence, and no help came. Everything was remarkably quiet, apart from little Juno, who was now whimpering at the sight of my pathetic, sorry state, crumpled on the ground like a scrunched-up piece of paper. Bear in mind I was unmarried, so by the time I scampered back to my home with piteous tears rolling down my cheeks, I called the emergency services and was rushed to hospital for immediate medical attention. All the while Juno was placed in the care of an elderly neighbour.
When I checked in at the hospital, they gave me a slight anaesthetic to straighten my wrist, and a few days later I had a major operation on my wrist where they used metal rods to straighten it. I want to tell you that that week that followed after my surgery was one of the most physically painful of my entire life. 20 years prior to this fall, I had broken my left wrist on a trampoline accident, but the pain was not anything near as close to as excruciating as this was. I knew I'd not be able to put pen to paper for a few weeks now, much to the frustration of my publisher, who now knew with an absolute certainty that I would not deliver the goods as far as my writing was concerned. Suddenly she had an inspirational, ingenious idea. "Why do you not go and spend a couple of weeks at my holiday cabin in Oregon?" she suggested. "It's in a very remote area, but I'll get Tilly to keep an eye on you and cook you all your meals. She's a brilliant housekeeper, you see, and lives on the smaller cabin on the land. If you cannot manage with your wrist, I could get Tilly to move in with you, and she can help you take care of little Juno by giving him some brisk walks on your behalf, until you get your strength back, of course. Your whole body has been through a traumatizing shock, and it needs plenty of time to heal." It took me a while to warm up to the idea, but I knew my publisher was right. Maybe a break was exactly what I needed to reinvent myself as a writer and come home fresh and inspired from my break. It was certainly better than staying at home all cooped up and feeling very sorry for myself. And if I needed any help, Tilly would be there. As for Juno, he would be in heaven in this idyllic countryside. What was there not to like about this amazing idea, I wondered. So there it was. I was to arrive at my publisher's cabin, and I did. And boy, was I blown away. She had understated how idyllic and bucolic the location actually was. The log cabin looked as if it come out of a high-class country living magazine. The Scandinavian-style log cabin had seamless, glorious finishes. It boasted magnificent golden floors, floating staircases, and large glass windows throughout the whole house, literally overlooking the most magnificent views over the rolling green valleys and the tranquil silvery lake. In the distance I could see the magnificent resplendent forest that seemed to stretch back for miles upon miles, and the best thing about this 300-acre property was that it was all privately owned by my publisher. Inside the cabin no expense had been spared. There were large comfy white sofas throughout, as well as a gloriously large stone fireplace and a sumptuous cosy bedroom that was fit for a king, with a killer bed laden with soft white duvets and plenty of feathered pillows. Tilly the housekeeper was from Ireland and had one of those sweet soft Irish accents, and boy did this woman love to bake and cook, from stew and dumplings to all manner of Irish steamed puddings, from spotted dick to jam roly-poly, and not forget my favourite, sticky toffee pudding. "Look at you," she said in horror. "Look at you. You're all skin and bones. But once you've had some fresh air, we'll get some meat on your bones and some good Irish cooking into that wafer-thin body of yours. By the time I've finished feeding you up, you'll be rolling out of here," she chuckled. I was still in dreadful agonizing pain, let's not kid, with my wrists, but managing to keep the pain at bay with very strong painkillers that did have the tendency to make me feel sleepy, sluggish, and lethargic, but I knew that this was part of the inevitable recovery journey. I suddenly felt happier than I'd been feeling for quite a long time, and it was so lovely to be breathing in this fresh, crisp mountain air and watching all the deer gathering at the lake. It didn't get better than this, I thought. "I cannot wait to explore the whole area," I said to Tilly. "It's magnificent out here." "Mind you keep away from the forests. That's the hairy man's domain, and he won't thank you for venturing on his turf," she warned me. "Who's the hairy man?" I asked Tilly, but she didn't answer me because she was making a caramel syrup and was watching the sugar ever so carefully in case it burnt. I imagined the hairy man to be a homeless vagrant living in the forest who was grumpy and bad-tempered with a short fuse. I'd seen enough cantankerous men in my whole life, and I knew how to deal with them superbly, even if I say so myself.
My grandfather growing up had been the most grouchy, crotchety person you could ever hope to meet, but I always managed to win in his favour with a few crafty techniques all of my own. So I truly thought dealing with this somewhat peevish, crusty, hairy man would inevitably be a piece of cake. After all, I had a lifetime of experience behind me. As a writer, Tilly warning me off exploring the forests of the hairy man was more like a green light for me, because when I write my novels, I love basing them on real-life eccentric and crusty characters that I've been fortunate enough to meet in my life. So whoever this hairy man was, I was eager to meet him. I had visions of a man with long white hair and long wiry beard who lived in a dishevelled old tent and lived off the land. So one day Juna and I ventured into the forest. I wanted to meet the hairy man for myself, and so I decided to bring him a basket of Tilly's delicious supplies, which included Irish soda bread, homemade strawberry jam, Irish shortbread, and the basket was so heavy with all this lovely stuff that I was carrying, but luckily I was using my left hand because my right hand was plastered and needed to be left well alone. As I ventured into the forest, shafts of beautiful sunlight danced through the open areas of the forest canopy, creating streams of pretty white light on the floor, causing all the green leaves to sparkle like yellow gold jewels, and it was ever so lovely to look at. As I walked, I crushed the pine needles beneath my feet, which gave the forest this gorgeous, fragrant scent of Christmas. It really was a fantastically enchanting day, and I felt incredibly delirious with happiness to be alive, and so relieved to no longer be suffering from the relentless hounding pain of my wrist injury, which thankfully had started to subside. I was surprised to see how quiet the forest seemed, and there was no sign of life absolutely anywhere. I did not come across any rabbits darting in and out of their burrows, or pretty little squirrels dancing from one branch to another. Neither did I hear any cheerful bird tweets. It all seemed very odd and strange, but nothing was going to stop me from enjoying this lovely, almost perfect day, nor was there anything that would hold me back. Not a single chance of that. I wanted to see, taste, smell, and breathe it all. As an author, you need to feel everything you recreate in your writing so that those memories from your experiences can be painted in your words, like an artist paints colours onto canvas. It's all an expression of life. Suddenly I sensed in every core of my being that I was being watched, and I could feel steel eyes on me, although I could not see them anywhere. I knew suddenly that I was not alone, and I felt this incredible, dreadful sense of foreboding. I know of no other way to describe it. Poor little Juno was far from happy. I could see his ears were standing up and his tail was tucked between his legs, and he was making the strangest yelping cry. I knew that he wanted to leave as much as I did. I noticed a little teepee in the forest that was made from timber posts that had been stacked over each other haphazardly. I looked inside the structure and I saw a nest which was neatly strewn with bones in one area, and I could smell a foul odour of damp dog-like skunk, all mixed together. What on earth was this structure, I wondered, peering inside it curiously. I'd never seen anything so peculiarly bizarre in all my life. It looked like some kind of a home or a hut. Suddenly I heard the most terrible growl that caused the whole ground to literally shake and vibrate. It was a horrifying sound, and it caused my entire body to shake violently. My stomach was literally in knots, and I began to feel the most dreadful nausea rising in my throat, and my head started to pound violently with what appeared to be the warning signs of an ominously bad migraine attack. I dropped my basket, and all the contents of food fell onto the ground in a haphazard heap, but I didn't care. I so badly wanted to run, and that was all I could think about in that moment. But I was incapacitated by a compounding fear that literally caused my body to freeze over like a massive block of ice. I could see this gargantuan black shape moving between the branches. It was like a shadowy form in the tree line that swayed from one side to another, watching me ever so closely, but always remained hidden from my sight.
Whatever this thing was, I knew it was colossal and monstrous in size, and it definitely was a treacherous, savage beast. Of that I was certain. I knew it could pounce on me and devour me in any moment. I had observed all those mauled and cleanly stripped animal bones lying in neat piles on the teppee, and I was fully aware that I could be next on his dinner menu, as far as this vicious, menacing beast was concerned. Suddenly I could feel this burst of adrenaline surging and rising through my body like powerful strongs of palpable currents of electricity. And then I found myself running and racing as fast as I could through the forest, with Juno running behind me. I promise you, I have never ever run like that before. And I knew in my gut that the worst thing you could possibly ever do when it comes to a predator is run away from it. But I could not suppress that desperate urge to escape this gruesome, evil, jumbo-sized beast. I was surprised that the creature was not charging behind me, or in hot pursuit of me like a lion, which I thought was exceedingly odd for a dangerous predator. Maybe he had eaten his full share of prey today, and was not hungry enough to add me to his dinner plate on this occasion, I thought. I never told Tilly about my strange experience in the forest and my search for the hairy man, because she had warned me off going there in the first place. I was sad that I had not encountered the grumpy, cantankerous man, because it would have been very interesting to have met him, good for my novels and my research as well. But there was no way on God's earth I'd go back into that forest again, even if you paid me £1,000,000. Not with that dangerous predator out there loitering around like a bad smell. The following day I was sitting on the wooden deck that enveloped itself snugly around our cabin, with Tilly and I sipping hot tea and eating Irish scones with jams and clotted cream. "This is the life," I said to Tilly. "It's magnificently enchanting out here." "You're not wrong, lassie. It's more beautiful than Ireland, and that's saying something coming from me, because I love the Emerald Isle more than life itself, because she is my motherland. But this place just cannot be beaten." Suddenly I noticed that Juno had been lying by my feet, was now sitting hunched up and growling furiously. Then I saw him, this dark, shadowy movement coming from the forests, and he walked towards us and turned my stomach cold. Walking through the tree line was an enormous apex predator, the likes of such that I have never seen before. The creature was gargantuan, at about 8 feet tall, and at least 800 pounds. This must have been the creature who was shadowing me yesterday, I thought, and he was more terrifying in the flesh than I ever imagined or even anticipated. His whole body was covered in thick, dark, sensuous brown hair, apart from the face that was completely hairless and covered in grey thick skin, with a protruding brow ridge, thin lips, and a very dark flat nose. The creature was humanoid and bipedal, with a very definite primate look to it, and its arms were so long that the creature would not have had any difficulty touching his ankles while standing totally straight. I noticed the creature was carrying Tilly's basket in his human-like hands that I had dropped yesterday in the forest, which he appeared to be returning, which was most odd for a creature as formidable as this one. We watched the creature park the basket at the cabin door, and then walk away on long, slender legs, taking 5-foot strides as he moved, while he swung his arms backwards and forwards, and he moved with incredible fluid grace. What's the hairy man doing here?" asked Tilly, looking aghast. "And what's he doing with my basket?" "Is that the hairy man?" I asked in horror. "But he's not human." "You went into the forest, didn't you?" said Tilly. "Did I not warn you to leave the hairy man alone? He doesn't like to be bothered. He's a loner that keeps himself to himself, and he doesn't like to be disturbed." "I thought you were talking about a hillbilly living on the land. I didn't actually think I'd run into King Kong," I said. "Oh, you thought the hairy man was human," laughed Tilly. "It looks like you got off lightly, because he can have a hell of a temper on him. He doesn't take kindly to strangers, but maybe your pretty face softened his heart. I think he might just have a soft spot for a pretty young thing like yourself. Perhaps there is a kink in his armour after all," she giggled. "Maybe our hairy man has a fluttering heart," she teased. I then told Tilly about the terrifying ordeal I'd actually had in the forest with the hairy man. I thought he was going to kill me, I told her. Kill you? Laughed Tilly. Never in a million years. Chase you out of the forest, definitely, but kill you, never. What kind of a creature is he? I asked Tilly. I've never ever seen one like him before. I'm not sure, she said, but he's been around here for a very long time, and he keeps himself to himself and never bothers anyone. He regards the forest as his domain, and we've always respected that as long as we've lived here. He does respect our space, much as we respect his. It's always been that way for as long as I can remember. Are there others like him? I asked. Oh, yes, he does have a female companion, and a wee little one, which they are very protective over and very proud of. That pair have been together for years. They're as thick as thieves, the two of them, and they have a very strong, powerful family unit. You mean they're monogamous? Oh, definitely, she said. You seem fascinated by the creature. I am, I said. I never imagined something so scary and terrifying to be so human-like and normal. Well, he is very smelly, laughed Tilly. He rarely could do with a bath, but he rolls in the mud all the time. I think he does that to ward off the bugs, but by golly does he stink. You always know when he's been around, because the place smells so rank. I often find him in the strawberry beds, and he smells. I retrieved the basket from the door and was surprised to see that it was filled with freshwater trout from the lake. Oh, my word, laughed Tilly. The hairy man brought you a present. You must have made an impression on him. I think he has a soft spot for you after all. Did I not tell you? She giggled. He never brought me trout as long as I've lived here, for many long years. Well, I thought the hairy man was human, didn't I said. So I brought him some of your baked goodies into the woods in that basket, and then I dropped them in fear when I came across that creature that I saw shadowing me in the woods, which just so happened to be the hairy man himself. Oh, so you brought him some of my stuff as a gift? Well, I thought it was a real live hairy man vagrant in the woods. The hairy man made such an impression on me because he was an apex predator that had terrified me half to death, but there was a whole other side to him that was actually endearing and almost gentle. I could hardly believe it. During the rest of my stay at my publisher's cabin, I continued to gift the creature with Tilly's homemade delights, but I always left the goodies outside the forest as a sign of respect, and never ventured inside. The hairy man would always gift us with trout from the lake. Sometimes it was a leg of venison, a deerskin, or even a couple of dead rabbits, much to Tilly's delight, because she loved making rabbit stew from one of her Irish recipes. When I returned home 8 weeks later, my writer's block had all but vanished. I was full of new inspirational ideas, and I began to produce several bestsellers, the best ever, at the time because of my encounter with the hairy man, which seemed to enhance my creative juices in ways that I never imagined possible. So there you are, that's my story. By the way, it was only in 2007 that I actually learnt that the hairy man that I met in the woods was a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, and I realised how fortunate and privileged I was to see one of these at close range, because I gather many people would dream to be in my shoes. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Joyce and I'm from Central Kentucky. I have an extraordinary story to share with you that came from my grandfather, and so that was an incredibly long time ago. Indeed, when he was a young boy and he was living on his dad's tobacco farm in 1930. I was a young girl when I learnt to diarise all the significant events in my life, including the full story my grandfather told me when I was only 14. I was sitting by a crackling fire on a cold winter's night when he told me his amazing story, which I'm so delighted to share with you and your listeners. Bear in mind that in those days nobody knew about the hairy man or about Bigfoot, so encountering such a monstrous creature would have been incredibly shocking, and much more so than it is today. So this is my grandfather's amazing account. I grew up on a small tobacco farm in Kentucky, where we grew dark fire-cured tobacco, I think it was. We made enough money to have a relatively decent life. Walking everywhere was our major source of transportation, or we would travel to locations using our horse and carriage. I would walk to school with a bucket and pail with all the other children. We didn't have shops like you do today, but a local store to buy flour, rope, mop and seeds. We would have our post delivered by the postmaster, who would come to our houses riding his horse and carriage. I do vividly recall that receiving a letter from far afield was one of the most exciting, thrilling things that could ever happen to you. People from all over America loved to write and receive letters, and the longer the letter, the better. If you received a letter, you would be likely to brag about it for days on end, because it was such a big deal back then. All the people in town loved hanging out at the post office, as it was quite a social place for gatherings and for catching up on all the local gossip. And believe me, like most small towns, we invariably had our fair share of gossips. The worst was Mrs. Lewis. Some people claimed that she was secretly listening to everybody's conversations by hiding out in the nearby bushes. Her brown head of short curls could be seen bobbing up and down in the bushes as her snoopy brown beady eyes were seen peeking through the shrubbery. It would seem that she would come out of the bushes, straightening her dress, but forgetting to remove the briars that had got snagged up in her hair, that would clearly give her cunning little secret away. Everybody knew what extremes and lengths that she would go to in order to get wind of some juicy gossip. If she puffed herself up with an air of self-importance and her lips started to inflate and twitch in the corners, you would know almost immediately that she had something very scandalous to reveal, that she was literally bursting at the seams to tell you. Invariably, she knew absolutely everybody's business, which husband and wife were at loggerheads with each other, who was having a smouldering affair, and exactly who was expecting a baby in the spring. You name it, she knew it all, and she was the walking gossip column of our town, and you didn't have to part with a penny to hear the latest news, as she invariably already knew it, and she was so eager to share it with you. If you had a secret, you avoided her at every cost, because in 5 minutes, believe me, everybody in town would know your secret. My father hired and paid local men to help him manage and harvest the tobacco crops on our 400-acre farm. The tobacco crop possessed a very pungent aroma which would waft over the valley due to the curing fire process that was late in the summer and early fall. Tobacco was cut into sticks and left to dry out in our large barns. It was hard work and very labour-intensive, so it really was a labour of love, requiring lots of work with your hands and the assistance of a mule and plough. We lived in the northern part of Kentucky, in an area that was rugged and highly timbered. The soil was not quite the same quality of the soil growing in the southernmost regions of the state. However, we were very fortunate that our tobacco plant thrived, as did our small production of vegetables. We sold vegetables and eggs to all the locals, as we harvested an excess of produce, which was more than what was needed. So that was very profitable for us. Sometimes we did direct exchanges with other farmers. For example, my father would swap chicken eggs and vegetables for cream and milk with another farmer, so we could make our own butter and cheeses. My father had an exponential amount of free-range chickens to keep the nasty grubs at bay, so roasted chicken and vegetables were invariably eaten quite regularly in our home, and without sounding very biased, my mother was the most spectacular cook. She was a very resourceful woman who would bottle pickles and preserve our food in glass bottles that were perfectly labelled so that we had plentiful supplies of food to eat during the leaner months of the year. She made pickles, jams, bottled fruits, chutneys, and the list goes on and on. There was a lovely enchanted wooded area on our land that embodied tall, majestic trees like maples, black oaks, American beeches and sourwood American holly trees that towered in the blue-grey firmament. There was a stunning trickling stream surrounded by rugged rocks that flowed through the area with a strong gushing current.
It was a magnificent spot for the wary, overheated workers to take a well-needed lunch break, which they invariably always did during the heat of the day. As the serene, peaceful forest filled with cheerful birdsong and the gushing sounds of the stream provided some refreshing shade and respite from the heat of the day for the wary workers, and, of course, some peaceful tranquility. One day one of the workers told my father that while he was eating his lunch, he watched a doe and her pretty soft fawn come to the water to drink some refreshing water, and they seemingly were unperturbed by the worker's presence. But very suddenly the doe became very anxious and afraid, and literally scampered away like greased lightning, moving incredibly fast. It was as if something had really rattled her cage, he said. I then suddenly noticed that even the pretty bird song had dissipated from the woods, and everything suddenly became incredibly still, foreboding, and very, very quiet. It seemed like there was a supernatural evil malaise that was so profoundly overwhelming. It was not of this world. It was utterly terrifying, he said. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest intensely, and my whole body went into spontaneous, shaking convulsions. And this was before anything actually happened. You see, I just sensed, he told my father, that something was incredibly wrong, almost as if we were being watched by a pair of very evil, sinister eyes. Suddenly we heard the sound of something very hefty and hugely gargantuan racing through the undergrowth, and it thundered towards us like a horse and carriage. I was utterly terrified and started to run away as fast as I could, glancing back only for a brief second. When I looked back, my eyes grew as round as saucers, as glancing back I could see my mate being pursued by this abhorrent creature, the likes of such I have never seen before. I was so paralysed with fear that I could not move a muscle, and as the creature had clearly not seen me, I crouched and lowered my body amidst the thorny briars and thick undergrowth, not concerning myself with the vicious attacks of the sharp thorns that tore my skin to shreds. It was a small price to pay to remain hidden from this dangerous, savage, apex predator. I observed this creature with an alarming horror through the open areas of long grass, and what I saw was almost impossible to comprehend. This thing was Herculean in size, weighing at least 800 pounds and probably more, and standing erect on 2 feet at an impressive height of 8 to 9 feet, and its width was about 5 feet across. It was without doubt a bipedal, perfidious monster of some kind, with a distinct look of an ape crossed with a man. It was truly wild. It was covered all over with very long, ashy grey hair, and every part of his brawny body literally rippled with muscle. It had a cone-shaped head that seamlessly blended in to a huge pair of shoulders. I noticed that the face was long, with a skin as dark and shiny as tanned leather, a very prominent furrowed brow ridge, and very deep-set, coal-coloured eyes. This creature was the most horrifying, demonic-looking being that I have ever seen. It was as if the gates of hell had opened, and he belonged in that domain. It was powerful, imposing, and an exceedingly strong creature. The creature seized Bert with his overlong, hairy arms and threw him high in the air. I watched Bert go spinning and whirling, and then come crashing down to the ground violently in a crumpled heap, with his legs landing over his head. He was killed on impact. I was certain of that, and I knew it immediately. No man could possibly have survived that hazardous fall. The creature tugged off Bert's head as effortlessly as we would pluck a grape from a stem. He then placed Bert's bloody, mangled head on a branch like it was a trophy of some kind. I watched as this jumbo-sized creature squatted on the ground and literally tore off Bert's forearm and proceeded to eat it like he was eating a giant chicken drumstick. I have never seen anything like it before, and he chomped Bert's arm down with a great gusto, licking his chops with huge satisfaction. He then discarded the leftover bones on the ground. I did not come back to work that whole afternoon shift, because I was so terrified and glued to the ground with absolute dread. The creature did not move from his squatting position under the tree, but rested there for most of the day, obviously digesting Bert, and then he waded to the stream. I think that was to get a little bit of coolness because it was a very hot day. I was too terrified to move until he came back, and he was soaking wet and shook his hair like a shaggy dog. And then he threw the rest of Bert's body over his shoulder like a sack of potatoes, and picked up the head in his hand, bouncing it in his hands like a ball. And then he disappeared into the woods. It was only then that I had the courage to come back. Once I knew that the monster had actually gone. I have never been so terrified and petrified in my entire life as I was in those moments. My father was incredibly shocked by the workman's bizarre and outrageous revelations, and he could tell the man was really rattled, and so he excused him and told him to take the following day off with full pay. "You must not tell anyone about that monster that you saw in the woods," he said. "Make sure especially that Mrs. Lewis never learns about this, or it will be around town in no time at all, and she'll have a field day with the gossip." My father reassured his worker that he would kill the creature himself with his Remington rifle once he found him. He knew that he had lost a very good worker, and he could not afford to lose another workman like this, so he knew the problem needed to be resolved, addressed immediately. If word got out to the gossips in the local community, especially Mrs. Lewis, about the monster on this land, it would be close to impossible to get anyone to work for him ever again, and his tobacco business would definitely fold. People were very superstitious in these parts, and the word about a monster getting out could potentially bring the community crumbling to its knees. So it was with great trepidation that my dad went into the woods to investigate the site where all the carnage had transpired. He came upon the large oak tree, and one of the branches was literally covered in thick blood, and pieces of Bert's skull with the skin and hair still attached clung to a little twig. My father was mortified by what he saw, but things were about to get a lot worse, because he found a humerus, ulna and radius that were cleaned to perfection, and were human bones that belonged to Bert lying scattered on the ground, and he gathered them in a heap to take back to his house. He knew that his worker's story seemed to be on the money and was very accurate. It was then, when he looked at the ground, that he saw the most humongous humanoid footprints that he had ever seen in his entire life, and it really caused his hair to stand on end in horror, because the footprint was at the very least 26 inches long and 10 inches across, and that meant one thing: this creature was colossal. My grandfather cautiously followed the trail of this creature, because drops of Bert's bloody corpse were seen on the ground, and so it was very easy to follow the path. After a while I came to a very menacing area where saplings of young plants had been twisted into arches and various peculiar shapes, and some branches had been deliberately snapped. Suddenly I saw the corpse of Bert hanging on a long branch of a maple tree, so I knew the creature must be very close by indeed, and I was proved right. You see, in my experience, the predator remains in close proximity to its prey. I could hear some whistling that sounded incredibly human-like, and so I hid behind a large cedar tree, and then I saw the monster for myself, and my workers' descriptions of the creature were not remotely exaggerated. On the contrary, they were probably under-explained. The creature was more elephantine than I could have ever imagined. In that second, I knew that my ammo was not going to be any use against this creature. If I attempted to shoot it or kill it, it would be likely to overpower me and kill me before I finished the job. I was in no doubt about that. I would have to devise a cunning plan to kill this beast in another way. I could see the beast was sharpening a stone upon a stone, and he really was nimble with his fingers that were as thick as sausages. This creature, whatever it was, I knew was exceedingly intelligent and that was a problem as far as I was concerned, because I needed to outwit it. I will not kid you, I was very cautious as I could, because getting away from the beast before he realized that I was there was imperative and had to be done very carefully. I was so terrified that the sound of my feet crunching twigs on the forest floor would get his attention aroused, and I couldn't afford for that to happen, because if I did, I would be next on the menu after Bert. I managed to get home very safely, and that was a very huge relief, and then I gathered my horse and carriage, and I made my way to visit Bert's widow, to tell her the tragic news about his untimely, unfortunate and tragic death. The whole family struggled to make ends meet, and life was exceedingly hard and tough for them, so it was easy for me to offer Bert's wife some kind of restitution. I offered to build her a house on 4 acres of my land that would be all hers, provided she promised not to tell anyone in the town about how Bert had tragically died on his job. I would also give her free access to vegetables and chickens to feed her entire family. The poor widow was very stoic and brave, but she wisely took my offer and did not tell a soul how Bert had been killed. On the contrary, she told people that he had died of a heart attack at her home. I did pay for all the funeral costs and gave her the arm bones of her husband to bury in the coffin, as regretfully the rest of his body was never recovered. After I had attended to Bert's wife's immediate needs, I killed 2 chickens, poisoned them, and then went to the area in the woods where I'd first seen the wild man with my own eyes. I assumed he lived in that location, and I was proved right because I encountered this enormous hut that was made with huge timber beams that are physically impossible for a human to lift, that he had piled strategically on top of each other. Inside the hut was a nest of hay that smelt hideously rank. I scattered the 2 dead chickens near the hut, hoping that the creature would eat them and succumb to a death. That was my plan, but it backfired on me. That very night in our farmhouse we were to hear the most terrifying crashing sounds and banging, and something was clearly going around our house, banging every area of our home and making the most horrifying noises that were terrifying. Also, we could hear the creature screaming at the top of its lungs, and it sounded exactly like a woman being murdered. I don't believe I've ever heard a sound so terrifying. All night the sounds continued until the dusk faded and the early morning light basked the escarpment in a warm, bright gold light. It was then that I saw the great giant gliding back towards the woods on his agile legs. He moved with such grace. That was when I finally had the courage to open the front door, and there, in front of me, were 2 poisoned chickens dangling on the wooden rafters. I emphatically believe the creature knew that I had tried to poison him, and he had returned the favour by bringing back the poisoned chickens, so I realised that I was very lucky to still be alive. In the end, I just left everything alone and continued with the tobacco farming business, and the workers still ate their food by that stream in the woods. But for some reason, we were never bothered again by that wild man, thank goodness, whatever he was, and that is a question that I am going to be taking with me to the grave, without ever finding the answer to that question. I will say that Mrs. Lewis did start spreading rumours that Bert had been killed by a monstrous ape in the woods, so how she got hold of that knowledge I do not know. Luckily, Bert's widow denied such a claim and told everyone in the town that he had died in front of her, and so for once Mrs. Lewis' wild allegations were dismissed by everybody. Truly, Miss Lewis was a walking tabloid paper, who in our day you would have hired as a private investigator, because she took snooping to a whole new level. So this was my grandfather's account, which I hope you and your listeners found of great interest. I know personally that I did. I am absolutely certain that he encountered a Bigfoot known as the Wild Man, that had a violent reputation, no fear of humans, and was known for killing people. Indeed, in our town, there were people who mysteriously disappeared, and I have my suspicion that this creature may well have been involved. I hope you enjoyed the story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.